Paul Smetanin, President and CEO of the Canadian Centre for Economic Analysis, CANCEA. Paul has an extensive background in financial economic risk management, risk measurement practices, and mathematical modeling of systems. His client list is impressive and wide-reaching across government and not-for-profit industry. Paul actually describes himself as an economic modeling disruptor, which I think is quite accurate indeed. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Paul, who will share with us his thoughts and research on the economic returns on public infrastructure investment. Please, a warm welcome for Paul Smetanin.
Thank you, Sean. Welcome, everyone. It's not often that, as a technically minded individual, that we get to come out from behind the numbers, get out of our pajamas, put on a suit, and actually talk to a group about the calculus of infrastructure value. One thing I will say, there's essentially 5 major contributions of value from infrastructure. And essentially, economic theory has done well to actually measure the first 3, which we'll talk about today. But really, this research report is about the 4th kind of value that comes from infrastructure. And when you listen to Minister Del Duce, he is talking about the 4th kind. And it's the 4th kind of value that we get from infrastructure that we intuitively know, but historically it's been very, very difficult to measure. Well, we've been working in the background for some time looking at the question of how to actually measure the systemic benefits of infrastructure. The other thing I'd also like to say is please, please, please do not run out and look at $1 billion worth of infrastructure as equal to 85,000 job years, because that is broken down amongst direct, indirect and induced, which is basically the value that you receive just by spending money. Whether you spend it on ice cream or you dig a hole in the ground, you'll pretty much get that benefit because it's just the swirl of money in the economy. They're the first 3 kinds. The 4th kind is the systemic benefit, and in that 85,000 job year number, 80% of it is systemic benefits. And it's really about the form and function of infrastructure that drives that value, not just spending money. The form is what you build, and the function is how is it used to actually support population growth, economic activity, and so on, is 80% of the value of infrastructure that we apparently, we actually evaluated. So really the conversation today is about the systemic benefits of infrastructure, and that systemic benefits can be your best friend. It can also be your worst enemy, because it's one contribution of infrastructure that can actually end up being negative if you get it wrong. So there's a lot of emphasis on getting the form and function of what occurs in infrastructure over the next 10 years right. And miraculously, this country is going to spend close to $500 billion on infrastructure over the next 10 years. Now, we hear in the media about government deficits, $1 billion here, $1 billion there. Can you imagine, for a moment, over the next 10 years, after $500 billion has been spent, if we get it wrong? What are we leaving for future generations? And that's what today is about, is talking about squeezing as much value as we can through the planning, coordination of achieving the systemic benefits of infrastructure investment in the next 10 years. Sorry, I should try and start to work this. Of course, we are very lucky to have come across the parts of RCCAO and OCS. Essentially, it's without their support, their independent, arm's length, great idea, CANCEA, go away, you tell us what the answer is and we'll live with it. It's without their support that this kind of research could not have been done. And this kind of research has a history to it. It began in 2003 We're going to talk a little bit about a simulation platform. We'll talk a little bit about agent-based modelling, but today's not about agent-based modelling. Today is about understanding the value of infrastructure and how important it is for us to be able to measure it. Something happened in 2007. We started 2003 working on the platform. In 2007, we had the global financial crisis. And something happened in the modelling, mathematics, evaluation community. And an academic trend started from 2007 that the models we're using are, in fact, can be very, very misleading. They can actually send us in the wrong direction, and they do not have the ability to understand the interconnectedness of our complex societies. Now, the good news is that we now have technology and data, and even the way we think is changing. And it's time for us to actually embrace that, and therefore this is disruptive of sorts in terms of the nature of the research. Since 2010, we've been working on the platform with a specific interest in socioeconomics. You've already seen the results of the platform. Have you seen the conversation about mental health in Canada? Have you seen the conversation about national cancer control across the country? Or the rising tide of dementia? It all came out of this platform. But it was a population health platform before it was turned into a nationwide comprehensive socioeconomic simulation platform. And we're only just getting started. You can tell that we've been busy in the last 12 months. So, the right level of investment. You may have heard every now and then that 5% of GDP is around the optimal. It's the direction that we should be going in. 5% of GDP should be invested in infrastructure. That actually first came out of our analysis in 2010 and 2011. And essentially that is saying that given the current circumstances within Ontario and across the country, we should be moving in that direction, of which about 3.9% should be, we look at new infrastructure, and then 1.1% of GDP is the maintenance and the repair of infrastructure. But what is the right infrastructure stock? I do not want us to get fixated on the amount of money that has been earmarked for infrastructure projects. We heard the Minister earlier talk about getting it right and trying to depoliticise infrastructure investments in our society. I do feel, and I am concerned as a researcher in the field, that if we don't get it right in the next decade, we're going to get it really, really wrong. Because the last 20 years have not been impressive when it comes to infrastructure policy within Ontario and around the country. So right infrastructure is about the what, the where, the when and the how much, and that is really hard to do. And if you accept the premise that the way we value things determines our choices and helps us make the decisions that we make, then we need to understand what value is, and in this case, generated off the back of infrastructure, but even more importantly, what value is at risk if we don't get the systemic benefits of infrastructure investment within this province. I don't expect you to read this, and by the way, if you want a copy of this presentation, please let us know and you'll be emailed a link to the presentation. But I'm anticipating the question of, Paul, what do you mean by infrastructure? It's a subset of the capital types within the platform, right? So we do have a fine-grained understanding of infrastructure types and how they get coupled together. So let's talk a little bit about what we've been doing in economics over the past. Typically, economic evaluation will concentrate on the first three contributors of anything, and in particular in infrastructure. If you spend money on infrastructure, you have a direct benefit of bringing in the industries that actually are responsible for constructing infrastructure. Then the next swirl of money in the economy is the intermediate, or what we call the indirect benefits of infrastructure. And they're the industries that are involved in supplying the materials, the concrete and bitumen and things of that nature. And then the third contribution of infrastructure is the induced. So if you spend money in an economy, it has a multiplier effect across both the direct and the indirect industries. Okay? Now, and of course that will determine or depend upon the value that you create across these three things, is where did you get the money from in the first place. But there are some significant pitfalls to just concentrating on the value of infrastructure, just using these three particular measures. That they focus upon simply the movement of money. They do not focus upon what the money had created. It's not focused upon the form and function of infrastructure and its importance to our society, in which infrastructure to us is the surface in which we work, live and play. Without infrastructure, we don't have a surface to do stuff on. And so these three measures actually ignore that value, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Interestingly enough, a recent study in infrastructure and its contribution to productivity, and this is a bit of a telltale sign of the way of thinking in economic evaluation, is looking at productivity of industry and looking at infrastructure investments according to these three, and then looking at the productivity of a firm. The conclusion was in this recent study, it's not ours, in this recent study is that investment in public transport actually has a negative effect on productivity. So there is a cleaning up exercise around the way we think about value. Because if you don't have public transport, if you don't have infrastructure, you can actually kind of forget that the employee is not going to show up for work. So what's productivity? That. So as economists, we are moving with the times. We're starting to adopt technology, and we're beginning to change the way we think about things from a systems point of view. So back in the office, we thought, okay, we have a big fancy platform. It simulates all different infrastructure types, and we can ask the platform, what if we invest $1 billion a year for 10 years in infrastructure? Or what if we spend $1 billion a year for 10 years on ice cream? Whether it's ice cream or it's a hole in the ground, the point is made. It's a cute example of if we measure the first three contributions of that spending, and then we put them up on a graph in terms of GDP, can you please tell me the difference between what you're looking at? Which line is infrastructure and which line is spending money on ice cream? And that makes the point. Our evaluation methods that are currently in use are not sophisticated enough to deal with infrastructure for what it is, a very complex value proposition. So, where's the missing ingredient? There is the fourth kind. Infrastructure does create stimulus. And essentially the first three measures, all they're measuring is stimulus, effectively. And that's why these measures are not sensitive to what you're actually spending the money on or what you're creating. But infrastructure is more than that. Infrastructure, as I've mentioned, is the surface that we work, live and play. It has enduring benefits in the support of economic activity and the support of society. So without physical infrastructure, it's easy for us to do the analysis on what infrastructure can contribute to productivity within an economy, because all you've got to do is take it away and see what happens. And it has a profound systems effect upon productivity. Firms can't get their goods in order to be able to produce things. They can't get their goods to their markets. And the way the economy develops, the way we attract capital in a global competitive market is largely dependent upon how good is our infrastructure policy along with healthcare and other things. So in addition to direct, indirect and induced, we are now talking about the systemic impact of infrastructure, and as far as we're concerned, this is all that ultimately really matters when it comes down to infrastructure policy, and yet has been largely not measured in the past. And we're hoping that we can actually change that with this new research. So systemic impacts is a measure of essentially the form and function of infrastructure. So depending upon what you build is the form, and depending upon how it is used is the function, will determine whether you can actually take $1 billion spent on infrastructure and multiply it by 85,000 job years over a 10-year, actually over a 30-year period. Right? You can't bank 85,000 job years off $1 billion worth of spending in infrastructure. What we can tell is you can bank about 15,000 job years, but the other 70, you've got to be smart, you've got to show up the right time, the right place, with the right stuff, with the right how much. So the systemic impact measures the way we respond to the fact that infrastructure is being laid out. How do we respond as economic agents and society to a new freeway, water, wastewater, and things of that nature? Infrastructure, how does it support economic activity? And essentially to do this point here, it's taken a team of economists, demographers, and yes, theoretical physicists to be able to put together the mathematics and the data collection and conspire as an interdisciplinary team to be able to understand the complexity of the role of infrastructure in our society and how it is an essential pillar of the economy. It's like kicking out one of the legs of a stool. If you kick it out, the stool will tend to fall over. But again, I'm going to emphasise, rules of thumb can be seductive, but they can be dangerous, particularly when you're dealing with such a profound, important pillar of the economy such as infrastructure. The business case of any infrastructure project is extremely sensitive, right, to the what, where, when, and how much. And that's getting back to form and function. We would prefer to see an economy spend 2.5% of GDP on infrastructure and get it right than to actually spend 5% of its GDP on infrastructure and actually get it wrong. So I've had to rescale the ice cream versus infrastructure in terms of the traditional approach on the left, because when we start to now look at what if we spend $1 billion a year for 10 years on infrastructure versus ice cream, what does it look like now if we start to truly appreciate the role of infrastructure in being able to support economic activity? I can explain later how this line is actually put together. There's about 1.8 trillion calculations that go into this result, which is giving you an idea of the complexity behind it. But on the right-hand side, it's now obvious, well, I'd like to think it's obvious, maybe I should ask you, is which line is infrastructure and which line is ice cream. And in fact, you can tell that the infrastructure, the 10-year investment in infrastructure that we're modelling here for $1 billion a year for 10 years, it's got a big hump, and then it starts to reduce down to a more sustainable support of the economy. What you just built for $10 billion in that 10-year period actually added something to the economy. It added surface. It added the ability to get things moving. People, capital, ideas moving. And that's why you actually see this persistence at the end, right? And that's the systemic benefit of infrastructure. And so when you begin to appreciate the systemic benefit of infrastructure, we're now 12 times the difference to ice cream. We're now 5 times difference to the job years. And when we reran ice cream within the prosperity at risk system, it generates about 8,000 jobs. However, because ice cream is low labour, high profit industry, right, the job creation is not as strong as infrastructure on its own. But when you put it all together and you model the entire province, municipality by municipality, and the movement of people over a 30-year period, this is actually what you get to see in terms of what was the imprint of spending that money on infrastructure. So let's break this down for a minute, because it's really important that we understand breaking down these numbers, because I would hate to see, again, taking $1 billion and doing the math, right? $1 billion times 85,000 times 4 is over 300,000 job years. No, it really depends upon what you spent it on, and it's going to take about a 30-year period to get that. But the difference between, remember, this is the traditional we're looking at. This is what we're used to doing. Direct, indirect, induced. Ice cream generates about 9,500 job years. A job year is essentially equivalent to one person working 1 year. So those job years are spread out over time. For infrastructure, we see that when we go through the direct, the indirect and the induced, right, and we shave off everything else, we get about 16,600 job years over 30 years, right, in terms of this particular stylised example. Now what we do is let's look at the systemic contribution of what we just spent our money on. Ice cream has no statistically significant contribution to the infrastructure or the surface of society and its ability to be able to hold up the economic process. But look at infrastructure. Infrastructure here is worth about 61%. The systemic contribution is worth about 61% of the value of infrastructure. Now, just imagine for a minute, the way we value things determines our choices, our decisions. This contribution has largely been unmeasured in the past because it is very difficult. But just imagine, by not measuring this and only measuring that, when you've got a lot of money on the table and infrastructure can be a rather political process, if you're not measuring this, it means you're creating a hiding place for politicians. Because if you get it wrong, this turns from potentially a benefit to what is at risk if you get it wrong. And so the whole idea, the paradigm here is to help measure, to help manage, and to try and get the most out of our scarce resources when it comes to debt and taxpayers' money. So in total, infrastructure in this case is about 43,000 job years. So it's not 85 because, again, it's very sensitive to the amount, where, when, and how much. But again, the interpretation is 39% of the value of infrastructure in this stylised example generates jobs. The other 61%, the form and function, what do you spend it on and how is it used, supports over 26,000 job years. That's a really important point, and I will not stop to keep emphasising this because it now turns, we now have an ability to measure this, which means that we now have the ability to look at decisions and start having a risk management conversation, start having a value at risk conversation, and to see if we can actually contribute to policy within this province. So now we turn to a more real-life example. So we ran essentially the Liberal Party's 10-year pledge to invest $130 billion in infrastructure in Ontario over the next 10 years. And again, keeping with my agenda of showing up the previous approaches, I've given you here the 30-year contribution of direct, indirect and induced. So as you can see, for every $1 billion spent of the $130 billion of the 10-year pledge, we can expect 15,000 job years. Just using the first three measures, we can only expect about $1.2 billion in GDP activity, and the taxation dollars are minimal. So when we run prosperity at risk, which is the mothership of the platform that we can talk about later, in the first 10 years, so this is the $130 billion 10-year pledge. In the first 10 years, when you have a look at the system side of infrastructure, it has the ability to generate about 45,000 job years per $1 billion spent. But that's over a 10-year period, and 66% of that number is the potential to support growth. Because when you're doing systems benefits, you've got to look at population. What's going on around you? The population's growing, right? We're competing with the global markets, we're moving commodities around and things of that nature. But as you can start to see, infrastructure is starting to pay for itself. And in fact, both the federal and provincial governments seem to be doing reasonably well out of the activity that it's generating within the economy. The other thing about this is, have a look at GDP, and there's two big contributions to GDP here. One is wages, the other one is private capital. What kind of growth are we looking at? This number or this number? We're actually looking at the generation of private capital, and guess what? That is the secret. That's the engine to our economy, right? It's a conversation for another day. But we are not attracting the capital that wants to be here. We're really only generating the capital that has to be here. Feeding people, housing people, doing that kind of thing. If we are going to be prosperous and we're going to grow differently to what we've grown in the last 20 years, we actually have to start focusing upon the capital that wants to be here. And infrastructure is a significant part of that process. But now we're going to open up the simulation to a full 30-year period. And what is the contribution of the next 10 years? The contribution is 85,000 job years. And at the end of this 10-year period, we now have the math and the computer simulations and the theories to be able to understand, did we actually get 80%, 70,000 job years per $1 billion spent? Did we get it? And the only way to do that is to actually have a look at what was $130 billion spent on and how it was used. And was it used in a coordinated fashion and things of that nature? So, measuring systemic benefits is difficult. It requires a simultaneous simulation and an accounting of past infrastructure investments, which is a good point. That number is 85,000 job years. Do you know why it's so large? It's because we are actually in an infrastructure deficit. And we have been now for a couple of decades. If we weren't in an infrastructure deficit, that number would change. It would go down. But basically the simulations are teaching us that there is a need for infrastructure. Give it to me, right? Because if we're going to have the population in the GTHA grow the way that we're expected to grow, it needs infrastructure. Population age, skills growth, labour force, economic development and policies. Systemic benefits don't happen on their own. They require a management, coordination and very clever planning to get things at the right place at the right time, the right thing and how much. For an example, if you build infrastructure but no one uses it, what's the systemic benefit of that infrastructure? Zero. The systemic benefit collapses to zero. If there's no current infrastructure deficit, what's the systemic benefit of infrastructure? It's going to be a lot less than 70,000 job years. But what the simulations are telling us is the system needs infrastructure, and it needs clever, coordinated infrastructure that's going to get people moving, capital moving, and ideas moving. I'll just do a little time check. So this, in our report, is probably one of the most important pictures or diagrams in our report, because it's showing the dependencies on what that 70,000 job years is about. Because, again, I don't want the message to be 85,000 job years, because that's utterly ridiculous, right? If you make the right decisions. Together, infrastructure can contribute that amount of economic activity. But it's dependent upon, for instance, the 10-year pledge. Then there's public infrastructure partners, and we can talk about Queen's Park and Ottawa shortly. Out of the same platform, we've done the numbers. We've simulated the entire country to understand that there's too much money leaving this province that does not come back by way of infrastructure investment from the federal government. But what else needs to happen? For every $1 billion that is spent as part of the 10-year pledge, we need to see at least 4 or more times private capital being attracted to the region. Now, getting infrastructure right, population growing, improving skill bases helps to contribute to that generation of private capital. As someone who runs and works with a team of economists, it's all about private capital by the end of the day. And then, of course, growth, skills, and access to the labour force. Right? We can talk about what's actually happening in the labour force and how the demographics of the labour force has changed. But there needs to be economic development policy coupled with the infrastructure plan. There needs to be a labour force policy and apprenticeship programs and other policies coupled with the infrastructure pledge. You realise that over the next 30 years, we're actually going to see 62 million extra life years lived in the GTHA, right? They're people that aren't even here yet, right? But when you add the growth of the population and look at the years of life that they'll be living, that's a lot of activity, which again needs a surface in which to work, live and play. There needs to be housing. I won't get onto the topic of housing. It's very contentious at the moment, but there's a lot to say around housing. But we need to see housing. And then, of course, consumerist consumption. But one of the things is that infrastructure is actually a rather lucrative taxation-generating tool for both the federal and the provincial government, not for the municipalities. And essentially, if you take that 80% rule, if government gets it right, they'll see about 1.7 times over 30 years of increased taxation revenue off the back of that. So they should be able to pay for the infrastructure they put in. If they get it wrong, you can reduce that number by roughly 80%, and all you're really left with is a deficit because you borrowed to invest, but the taxation revenues didn't come through. So, coming back to the key point here is how we measure things, how we value things determine what we do, how we make choices, how we plan. The right infrastructure is ultimately about what, where, when and how much. And if the systemic benefits, so I've put myself into your shoes and I've sort of said, well, hang on, Paul, if this is so obvious, if we've been talking about intuitively the benefits of infrastructure for so long, why haven't we done it? The reason why it hasn't been done in the past is because it's very, very, very difficult to actually figure out and do. And it takes an interdisciplinary team to actually have put the platform together. But certain things have happened, right? Getting realistic sensitivity to if we play games in our computer simulation system is very hard to accomplish. But we now have technology, the data. Big data is, I'm sure, a phrase that you've heard, and cloud computing. This is a massive simulation platform just to figure out if I change the footprint of different municipalities across this region, right, how is the economy expected to actually change in response? But we also need to do one other thing, is a paradigm shift. And this is where the financial crisis of 2007, as hard as it was, actually did a great service to the way we think about planning and evaluation and the way we model systems. Because it really does require an interconnected appreciation of how society is stitched together, because if I invest in one particular area, it's through those interconnections that value reverberates. I will quickly, so that is about the report. What we're going to do now is let's take the platform out for a spin and just talk a little bit about the platform, and then let's talk about Queen's Park and Ottawa, for instance. So the platform, it's not an Excel spreadsheet. That's the point of this slide. There's over 36 million individuals running around in this platform across the country, right? Across over 5,500 different census levels, most definitely through the 444 municipalities within Ontario. There's a lot going on here is the point. But we don't model a system from looking at it from above. We're not omniscient. We don't have the first principles and the derivations to figure out what everyone's going to do over time. We actually go down to street level. We model with individuals communicating, with individuals trading, going to work and doing stuff. And that's what agent-based modelling is all about, because then we start to see the economy emerge from all the interactions of the many. And then we can put in a freeway or we can put a rail system and we can begin to understand a little bit about how people might use it and generate economic activity. And by doing that, every time we come up with a number for a municipality or for the province or for the GTHA, that number is connected to every other number in the simulation. Right? So it really demands a consistent discipline across the mathematics to make sure we're not creating money or destroying money, to make sure that we're internally consistent. And behind these numbers, it allows you to go from that number to the, okay, you got my attention, Paul, where should I look? Right? And so you can start to break down these numbers through the platform to understand where is value. Who are the winners, who are the losers? Right? Infrastructure can be an expensive enterprise, so we might want to find out who the winners are and actually ask them to maybe make a contribution. And when we're talking about taxation dollars, I'm not just talking about one number of taxation dollars, for instance. We're talking about every single tax. Because in this platform, we have each level of government and every single tax type embedded in this. So if you change an activity within the simulation in one activity, we can actually start to see how it connects to the taxes that people pay. And again, this is just reinforcing the systems concept, right? That you cannot look at something in isolation, without understanding what are the follow-on consequences of this particular investment. So, general weaknesses of models: garbage in, garbage out, oversimplification. That's something that economists have been struggling with now for over 100 years. So in economics, and this is what fascinates me about economics compared to physics, in economics, you create a mathematical model that will describe the behaviour of someone, and you watch them, and then they go and do something else. Damn it. We need new theory. Okay, we're going to come up with a new theory. It's going to be called irrationality. Because the person didn't do what my model said that they should do. The point is, in physics, if you have a mathematical model and nature does something different to what the model is suggesting, the model's wrong. Right? So there is a bit of a paradigm shift that in economics we have to appreciate individuals and people. We have to succumb the oversimplification. And with agent-based modelling, it allows us to let people be people and live locally and do stuff. It's for us to then sum this up over thousands of simulations to begin to see the size and the shape of the economy that they're forming and how that might actually change in time. So in the past, there's been several reports on this, and we've just updated this, and we're just about to talk about Queen's Park and Ottawa very quickly. I won't belabor the point. We've been underinvesting in infrastructure through the 80s, a little bit in the 90s. It picked up since 2000, starting to drop a little bit again. Infrastructure is primarily borne by Queen's Park and the municipalities. Queen's Park in the middle essentially is primarily non-residential construction with some engineering components. The municipalities are primarily responsible for the engineering components and less responsible for the non-residential side of things. Now, here's the surface. I'm going to explain it to you real quick. It's not as hard as it looks, but in the computer simulation platform, we can run every version of Queen's Park and municipalities' policy on how much they want to invest in infrastructure against every version of the federal government and what they're investing in infrastructure. So if you look up 2 and 2, it gets you here. And what this surface is, it's just basically economic growth over 50 years. Because then what we do is we ask the question, well, where is Ontario, the municipalities in Queen's Park at the moment? It's here. It invests at the moment, about 2.8% of GDP on infrastructure. Where's the federal government? Here. That's its contribution to Ontario infrastructure. So, if this relationship persists, are we getting the most out of our economic activity? Because every point on this surface, we've rerun the system to find out how's economic growth changed. And we're currently here. Now, when you have a look at the slope here, you can see that it's steep. It means that our economic growth in Ontario is very sensitive to wobbles here and to some wobbles here. Okay? So when you underinvest in infrastructure, you're actually exposing a sensitivity, a risk to the very economic prosperity of the system. So that's where we currently are, and this difference between here to here, we don't like the word optimal. Optimal is really the direction we should go in, as opposed to a precise point and a precise time in the future. The point being is that we're better off up there than down here. This $7.5 billion is essentially the amount of money that is currently leaving the province and not coming back. That if you follow the premises, that if you're a beneficiary of something, you may want to contribute to the cost. Well, if we follow that in proportion, then the federal government we would argue that the federal government should be bringing back an extra $7.5 billion a year into Ontario infrastructure. And guess what? The federal government does very well out of infrastructure activity in Ontario. Really well. We've got all the surface diagrams and everything else. Please come down and join us. We're downtown and we'll show you. But guess what this represents out of the federal government's pocket? It represents 20 cents in the dollar of what the federal government gets out of Ontario infrastructure activity in taxation revenue. Right? So this is not asking to give us back all the benefits. This only represents 20 cents in every surplus dollar that the federal government has in its pocket once it does its tax calculations and what it has invested in infrastructure in Ontario. And two more slides. What this graph shows is the fiscal deficit position of the Ontario government over a 50-year period. We're assuming nothing changes other than infrastructure policy. And so Ontario does appear to be between a rock and a hard place. Because again, what this black line represents is a balanced budget in Ontario. So the question here we're asking is, can Ontario invest its way out of a deficit without doing nothing else? Right? Not looking at healthcare or other efficiencies, just infrastructure. So here again, if Ontario invests more out of sources of funds from Ontario, it still cannot get itself out of a budget deficit through infrastructure activity. And what happens? If it invests less, it's actually getting worse. The distance between here and here is greater than the distance between here and here. Ontario is actually stuck. So if it's going to balance its budget, either it talks to Ottawa to look for another contribution, or it needs to look for other areas in which it can actually get itself above this line. Now, remembering we have federal policy here, and we can see that Ontario can't do much more than keep doing what it's doing from a fiscal deficit point of view. But the federal government can. And this is a report that came out in 2014. And I was pleased to see that when we saw the federal government announcement in terms of increasing its infrastructure contribution to Ontario, I was pleased to see that someone had read the report, because their contribution appears to actually bring the province very close to using infrastructure to actually help balance its fiscal deficits. Now, I want to reiterate that that's just infrastructure activity. The point being is that without external help, Ontario cannot invest itself out of its fiscal deficit. But what is being proposed by Ottawa nudges us up, it gets us moving in the right direction, but it's questionable as if it's really going to close the gap. Very quickly, our objectives are super simple. We want to measure so that ultimately society and policymakers can make the decision, make the trade-off. Because it's hard enough to make trade-offs if you don't know what you're trading off. And we're hoping that through the measurement of systematic benefits of infrastructure, remembering that it's different for every different situation, it's very important to actually get that right. And from a long-term sustainability point of view, we're not here to tell you what to think. We're really here to give you information about what to think about. With that, thank you very much. I appreciate your patience.
Thanks very much, Paul. It was a great job. Economics 402. That was a very comprehensive overview, and you were testing the limits of my minor in economics there, but really do appreciate that analysis. We have a couple of minutes for some questions. I would ask that you would come to the mic, please, and just state who you represent and who you are, and Paul will be happy to answer a couple questions. Welcome.
Hi, I'm Marcy Birchfield, the Executive Director of the Neptus Foundation. Paul, I just became aware of this report recently, and thank you for the invite here. Very, very interesting presentation. I did also see a piece of work that your firm did on the places to grow, which I think gets at the question, right investment, right place, right time, because that report was all about the timing and the allocation, the spatial allocation of where we expect population and employment growth to go. And I think I'd be really interested to hear you comment on what you think the current sort of thinking is on that and where there might be a disconnect.
Is that mic on? Do you want to come up here, Paul?
Sure.
Okay. Marcy, great report that you released last week. Thank you very much on the places to grow side of things. Yes, we had done our own analysis from the same platform on what's happening in the population and what's happening for jobs. We're actually somewhat critical of places to grow. Places to grow is the numbers are done without acknowledgement that people follow money and money follows people. I'll leave it at that. The problem we have with places to grow, and Neptus has also identified this very fact that demographic and population projections really require a healthy understanding of the socio-economic landscape on the ground. And our concern is that places to grow, from a jobs point of view, we can't recover places to grow projections. And when we simulate Ontario, we're simulating 444 plus regions over, say, a 30-year period. And we can't recover that. So think for a minute. If a municipality has to plan to places to grow, they're expecting the jobs to show up. Like in Peel region alone, right? We only expect to see half the jobs at places to grow expects to show up by 2041. So using region of Peel as an example, what if they plan, not just plan, but service with expectation of those jobs showing up? Well, you're going to have infrastructure that's not going to have a productivity, a rate of return, which means that the revenues won't be there to pay for it, which means debt, right? Which ultimately comes down to an impact upon the taxpayer. So yes, we're dealing with a very complex and important topic that is interconnected across places to grow, which is interconnected across the Ministry of Economic Development, Employment and Infrastructure. I preferred their previous name, the Ministry of Infrastructure. And it's very connected across the Ministry of Finance and things of that nature. So I appreciate your question. The idea behind this systems approach to say whether it's prosperity at risk or if someone else has got an agent-based platform that does socioeconomics in the country, please let us know. But the point being is that you can put many topics into one calculation now without losing the texture and quality and the respect for each topic. And then you can begin to ask questions of, well, from a sustainability point of view, what seems to make the most sense? And then you let society make the trade-offs. At least they know what they're trading off.
Hey, Paul. Thanks for that really enlightening, actually, presentation. I was really impressed. My name's Howard Tam. I'm an urban designer, and always interested, actually, in what we call human experience design for cities. How can we actually build great experiences for people so that they can live, work, and play in a great environment? And so what your presentation was bringing up for me, and I was just thinking about it a little bit, was you talk about a lot of these sort of intangibles, a lot of these sort of systemic impacts. So I'll just give you an example, right? So sort of when you talk about design, you can build a street, and that's a street. You could build a street that's really lively, that has lots of great programming, that has wonderful shops on it. It's a beautiful place to hang out in. And that has other sorts of economic benefits because people want to spend more, they want to buy things. They actually might run into their neighbor who turns out to be their next business partner, and that becomes another sort of like amazing economic benefit. And a lot of times these things are sort of like, they're kind of seen as these intangibles, hard to measure, difficult to sort of understand. And so I'm just wondering, like when you talk about some of these sort of design-based elements, right? These features that make you feel great, these features that give you great experiences, is that something that your model is able to measure? And I'm curious about that because it's something that I think in the design world we always have trouble with sort of being able to articulate a value proposition on.
Yeah. Like economics generally, the model doesn't deal well with the fifth contribution, and I'm surprised no one asked, Paul, what's the fifth? It's well-being. It's about health. It's about well-being. It's about the concept of place. And that's what you've just spoken about.
Right.
It's qualitative. It's based upon many societal values and things of that nature. And I think that modelling can be great, but it's got to stop somewhere, right? Because you don't want to turn life into a technocracy or whatever. The point being is that the fourth contribution is systemic. It's not qualitative, it's real. Right? Real consequences behind real decisions. And the coordination and the planning I'm referring to is just joining the dots in the right way. Then, from an urban planning point of view, you just talked about the fifth contribution, the concept of a place that people want to be, where they want to use the infrastructure, because when you have infrastructure gets used, it's productive, right? So you might have a train line in a particular direction that's not used very well, but if you sprinkle a little bit of broadband on that, you might find all of a sudden ridership increases, right? That's the sort of coordination that we're talking about.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, one more question and we'll have to go to break.
Okay. Steve Wickens, I'm a freelance journalist and sometimes thorn in the side of politicians, et cetera. I'm just trying to think how this model might apply, and one example I was thinking of in my head while you were speaking would be, would you be able to, for example, take something like the Regional Express Rail plan, which would provide, these much more frequent service, two-way all day, with it just as, that infrastructure, versus providing that infrastructure and also putting in place a scheme where you would really make use of the massive amounts of real estate that Metrolinx owns around its GO stations to develop real urban hubs there, because a lot of people are pointing out recently that if we don't turn all these GO stations into real destinations, the operating costs of regional express rail are going to massively outstrip the new revenue.
Right. That's another level of detail, local detail, that the model actually does capture a large part of that. but it doesn't finish the job. And that's why you've got people like Professor Miller was here earlier. And University of Toronto has been working on, and I believe it's complete, an agent-based model of transportation network in the GTHA. Guess what? We're actually using the same approach. We're coming at it from different points of view. So what happens is that prosperity at risk, it takes into a lot of considerations, which basically establishes the kind of volume and the kind of value combinations you may be looking for. Then, to your point, you get the planners, you get different kind of model with a different, what we call different kind of resolution, right? Because sometimes when you increase the resolution on one topic, you lose it on another. The analogy would be is you can't be in a room and outside the room at the same time, right? Same with modelling. So we look at it, we can actually give some broad case better combinations, but then it's up for another model to come in with a different, coming at it from a different point of view, different resolution to actually assist with that. But talking about this model, back in 2010, I was talking to Andy, and the vision was that when we see big decisions being made within the city, Toronto community housing, you've heard John Tory talk about that, that's straight out of the platform, right? So we've been modelling the city as well. But the point being is that when we see decisions being made, we want to be able to be there and run it quickly and give people a sense of what's being traded off, because we're kind of hoping that when we are on the right path, we stay there. And the only way we can do that is people like yourself and others, and there is a role for economic evaluators in the room to say, okay, you just changed your decision, this is what it's going to cost society. I hope that helps.
I hope it does, yeah. I mean, is there any way that we can sort of work with the model?
Yeah.
On that specific question, even.
That's what we're looking forward to, is questions like that and others.
Cool.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
One more.
I'm just concerned about time. I'll look to Andy, or I'm on my own up here. Hey, I got to be the bad guy. One more question. One more. Okay.
Bill, transport economist. Well, this is a great presentation. You've done a lot of work here. I think it's particularly valuable in the federal provincial fiscal discussion. What you've got is a macroeconomic approach at the disaggregate level, as opposed to the more traditional macroeconomic approach at the aggregate level. But there's a whole other dimension of project evaluation, which is microeconomics, which more explicitly takes demand into account. And so I'm wondering if you use this in specific examples to compare your disaggregated macro approach against the micro approach.
Yes. So with agent-based modelling, demand and supply is naturally factored in, because in the model there will be a firm, and that firm has to actually get inputs from somewhere. So it's now demanding inputs, and it may actually have to compete with other firms in the area, or the inputs may not be there. Well, guess what? That firm doesn't produce. So we are building in, we have built in a certain level of demand and supply. Now, you're correct in that this is not a microeconomic simulation platform, because it's at that point where you begin to lose certain resolution. You've got to give something up to go there. I know that you're very well aware of that. But what this is we would consider this more of a meso economic approach, in which at the end of every simulation, we go around to every single agent and we look at what they bought and sold, what they did. They may have died, they may be still alive, and we add it all up to create an aggregate view of what the economy is for that particular year. But yeah, we can definitely talk offline about the nuances around demand and supply. And there's a Russian saying, the first pancake is never the prettiest. They just get better, and that's what's actually happening with this particular platform, is every time we keep running projects through it, add more data, it is slowly getting smarter in terms of being able to seek out the direction that we may want to move in.